talk principally about my experience in Venezuela, where I was for 7 years. And that is, the question that basically Ingo was posing was, what lessons are there from that experience? And there are a number of lessons. One certainly, and I had just thought of this a moment ago because it's important to raise, is that you can't change the world without taking power. And that is, contrary to John Holloway or various anarchist theorists that you can change the world without taking power, Latin America and certainly Venezuela, demonstrate that you need the power of the state. You need the power of the state if for no other reason than to take it away from them. And you can't pretend that they don't have the army, the police, the judicial system, etc. So that's one thing that one always has to keep in mind. Another thing is that it points to the importance of building institutions and practices by which people develop their capacities. I think that's absolutely central, and I think it's a central theme. It's a perspective I had before going to Venezuela because it was a focus on human development, the development of human capacities, and the importance of practice in this, which goes back to Marx's concept of revolutionary practice, the simultaneous changing of circumstances and human activity, or self-change. People change through their practice, through their activities. And that in Venezuela, you could see that very clearly. You could see that in the workers' council movements. I worked with the recovered people in the recovered factories and also in some of the state sectors. But also, you especially saw it in the community, the communal councils. These were councils created in the urban areas, 100 to 200 families, and in the rural areas, 20 to 50 families, in which they would come together and make local decisions. And this was absolutely critical to see, important to see, because what you could see from these local organizations and from the participation and protagonism that was involved in these organizations was the way in which people developed strength and dignity and pride in everything they were doing. They would get, for example, some money to patch up a part of the road. They would talk to you with pride about how they figured out a way to extend the money they had to build much more, changes roads, or they'd get a certain amount of money to build 10 houses. And you'd go to community after community, they say, we built 15 houses, and this is how we did it. We removed one bathroom from each. They didn't need 2 bathrooms. So you got this sense of accomplishment and pride, and I think that is absolutely essential. That concept of bringing, power to people, it was certainly at the core of much of Chavez's thinking. He said, and there were problems in the gap between discourse and practice in his case, but what you could see was, he said quite early, you can't deal with the problem of poverty unless you give power to the people. And he looked at these communal councils, and he was very key in promoting the institution of these councils. He looked at these councils and said, these are the cells of a new socialist state. That they have to work with the workers' councils, and he talked about how what we have now is state capitalism. You can't have socialism without workers' control. I mean, he was very clear and specific in talking about this, and I think that that's something we have to learn here as well. That you don't get that development of human capacities and people's pride, sense of pride and dignity. You don't get it by various vanguardist models, in which an enlightened few bring socialism to the unenlightened masses. That you have to create the conditions in which people develop their own sense of pride, dignity, and accomplishment. And you don't get it, obviously, too, from social democracy and various forms of parliamentary fetishism. And certainly, what you get, if you don't involve people in making these kinds of decisions, in allowing them to develop in this way, you get the kind of pattern which threatens at various points in Venezuela. You get the kind of pattern which replicates the Soviet, the so-called real socialism, in which people did not have decision-making power in the workplace. They did not have decision-making power in the local organizations. They did not have local organizations. Everything, there was only anointed, acceptable organizations rather than any sense of movements from below. So, I think the story of real socialism is don't do this at home.
which lesson would you really draw from your from your own trajectory from 70s revolutionary to People's Social Forum activist in 2013, 2014, who hopefully will be a socialist with us when we are taking power next time?
Michael just put his finger on it when he spoke about vanguardism. You know, we started from an absolute belief that the conditions for revolutions were there. What was missing was consciousness. It's not that we didn't have revolutionary zeal, but that historical impatience can play tricks on you, and it did. And of course, at two levels. For us, for those who were enthralled by the Maoist model in China, what happened in China towards the late 70s was a tremendous deception. But more than that, I think two other factors came in. One was the incredible economic crisis which erupted in the 80s, caught us completely off guard. Not that we didn't expect capitalism to go into crisis, but we did not think that a right-wing movement would come out of the economic crisis, which it did, which was neoliberalism. Some of us, I mean, we were quite young in those days, you have to remember. Some of us believed that if you were in crisis, on the contrary, the illusions about social democracy and reformism would almost fall by themselves, and that would open the path to socialist revolution. Of course, it didn't happen that way. I think Michael puts the hand on it. We have to build a model of left activism, which is both revolutionary but democratic, plural, able to integrate all these issues. Not easy to do, but I think it's part of the cultural evolution that we have to do inside our own conception of things. Now, how can you combine a revolutionary left organization, which is not vanguardist at the same time? I mean, theoretically, I'd like to do that, but I'm not sure exactly how it would function. But hopefully, looking at the Latin American model, this is something we can discuss and debate. You know, can you actually move towards transforming the system without something which acts as a command post or a vanguardist organization? This is something I think that would be interesting to look at.
Is voting NDP all that can be done in BC just because there's not as much socialism in BC naturally or for whatever reason as there is in Venezuela or Quebec?
Okay.
Loaded question. Good luck. Good luck there.
No, he knows I have strong opinions. So let me start. Most people, I think, in the room are residents of BC, and so most of you can probably think about how you felt in May of, what day was it, May 15th, the day after the election of this spring. And you know, so I'm in my 40s, I've lived through plenty of elections by now, but probably the sense of disappointment, I'm not sure I've seen that on the same scale before in my experience. I have to say, I think I felt like I was the only happy person on May 15th. There was a deep funk, but I actually didn't feel that deep funk. And I want to explain why, because I think it's part of the key to trying to figure out some of these questions, at least for us here, you know, immediately, where do we go in terms of organizing? I grew up in Victoria, but I actually lived in Ontario in the Bob Rae years, and so already had some experience of what it was like to live under an NDP government that wasn't doing the right thing, and where that led. And I also was, you know, I'm a slightly different generation. I'm a Gen Xer, born in 1970, for whom the last 10 years were really hard. You know, it was like finally in the late 90s, social movements were erupting again. There was Clayoquot Sound, there was, I mean, it was mentioned this morning, there was APEC, there was, you know, all of this, and it was silenced after 9/11, or it certainly felt that way to me. And in that decade, not only did you have kind of the crash of the social movements, but you had the rise of Blairism. and really the experience of social democratic parties and the New Way, and kind of where that led. And so when May 15th turned around, I have to be honest, my feeling was, thank God I don't have to live through 4 years of watching everybody get disillusioned slowly. I mean, that was my feeling, was that there was a grand setup. People's expectations were so high, so high. I mean, somebody mentioned 2004. There was, those of you who were around remember, there was a big fight back in 2004. We got, you know, my take, we got sold out by the leadership, or, I mean, and not to just blame them, we didn't have rank and file organizations pushing them in the right direction. And, you know, I didn't want to have to go through the experience of seeing those expectations kind of slowly chipped away at. And so there was actually something slightly liberating at seeing them crash immediately, because that's kind of what it felt like. I actually, 2 days after that, people who have been over to the island might be familiar. We have a pretty radical city councilor named Ben Isett. And he and I are involved in trying to create something new. We're calling it the Social Environmental Alliance. And we had actually organized our first public meeting for 2 days after the election. And we kind of planned it, assuming the NDP would win, because that's what everyone thought. And so it was really fascinating to see what happened at that meeting in this kind of, you know, moment of shock that people were going through. I mean, I think our challenge right now, we just have to, we're not at the place to, you know, necessarily be focused on the, well, we have to talk about the big questions, but we actually have to talk about an organizational question, and I think that's kind of on everybody's mind here. So, you know, I'm not sure I have an answer, but I think the organizational question is, we've got those 3 groups. We've got a moment in time. How do we build something that is attractive and incorporates, but doesn't fall prey to the errors of history that we can learn as well? And that's a big, hard question.
If you can change your vote when you change your mind, that is what democracy is all about. Now polling.ca.
Perpetual democracy doesn't mean that you have to vote every day. It just means that you have the right and the ability to vote anytime you want. And that is what perpetual democracy is all about.